What if I told you that a single second, a single assumption, could destroy lives? That in the blink of an eye, someone's entire identity, their achievements, their very existence could be erased by a mistake? Sounds extreme, right? But here's the truth no one wants to admit. Your uniform doesn't always protect you. Your status doesn't always save you. And sometimes it doesn't even matter who you are, just what someone thinks you are. This isn't just a story. This is reality. A decorated U.S. Army officer, a man who has dedicated his life to serving his country, finds himself at gunpoint on the very streets he fought to protect. But here's the twist. The man aiming the gun at him, he's supposed to be the one protecting the community. How did it come to this? What happens when the people we trust to uphold justice make the wrong call? And more importantly, what happens next? Stay with me, because by the end of this, you might never see the world the same way again. The air in Brighton City was thick, heavy with the kind of heat that made everything move slower. Asphalt shimmered under the weight of the relentless sun, and the rhythmic hum of car engines filled the streets. It was the kind of afternoon where people dragged themselves from one air-conditioned refuge to another, wiping sweat from their brows, avoiding prolonged eye contact with strangers who were just as miserable in the heat. At the corner of Jefferson Avenue, an old busker played the saxophone, his melody weaving through the honking cars and murmured conversations. A mother hurried her child along the sidewalk, fanning herself with a folded-up newspaper. A group of teenagers huddled near a storefront, laughing at something on one of their phones. Life moved, ordinary and unbothered, until it didn't. Through the crowd, a man walked with the kind of presence that naturally parted people without him even trying. Major Elijah Carter wasn't in uniform, but there was something about the way he carried himself, tall, broad-shouldered, his every step measured, that commanded respect. His deep brown skin gleamed with sweat, and despite the stifling heat, he looked composed. A plain black t-shirt stretched across his muscular frame, tucked neatly into dark jeans. His boots, worn but polished, hit the pavement with a quiet authority. Elijah wasn't here on business. No military meetings, no security details, just a day off. A rare one. He had spent the last 15 years serving his country, earning his way up the ranks, proving himself time and time again in ways most people couldn't begin to understand. Yet here he was, a soldier simply trying to enjoy a walk, maybe grab a cold drink from the cafe up ahead. A silver sedan crawled along the curb, windows down just enough to let the heat escape. Inside, Officer Daniel Whitaker sat behind the wheel, his fingers drumming impatiently against the steering wheel. He was in his early 30s, a man who had spent the last 8 years patrolling these streets, memorizing their patterns, their faces, the rhythms of Brighton City's daily grind. He wasn't a bad cop, not in his mind. He followed the rules, kept his head down, did his job the way he was trained to do it. But training only went so deep. The radio crackled. Unit 3-4, be advised, we've got a possible armed robbery suspect in the area. Last seen near Jefferson Avenue, male, dark clothing, possibly armed. Use caution. Whitaker's jaw tightened. He scanned the sidewalk, his pulse kicking up a notch. His eyes landed on Elijah, a black man, tall, well-built, dressed in dark clothes, walking with purpose. Whitaker's brain, without hesitation, connected the dots that weren't actually there. His grip on the steering wheel tightened. Elijah slowed near a jewelry store window, glancing at a watch on display. His fingers dipped into his pocket, just for a second, feeling for his phone. Whitaker's heart slammed against his ribs. His instincts screamed, suspect, possible weapon. He reached for his radio. This is Officer Whitaker. I've got eyes on a possible match. Jefferson and 6th, engaging. His car door flew open. Elijah barely had time to register the movement before he heard the voice. Hands up! Get on the ground! The words hit him like a shockwave. He turned, slow, measured, trained to never make sudden movements in situations like this. The moment his eyes met Whitaker's, the weight of the moment settled onto his chest like a lead vest. A gun aimed directly at him. Pedestrians froze. Someone gasped. A woman instinctively reached for her child, pulling them close. A young man pulled out his phone, his thumb already pressing record. Elijah's pulse remained steady, not because he wasn't affected, but because he had spent years teaching himself to remain calm in the face of danger. His training had drilled into him that panic never solved anything. He had stared down enemies on foreign soil, negotiated hostage situations, led missions where one wrong step meant death. But nothing quite prepared a man for this. He exhaled through his nose, his hands lifting, not in surrender, but in control. "Officer, you're making a mistake," he said, his voice deep, calm, but unyielding. Whitaker didn't lower the gun, didn't even flinch. His training had prepared him for split-second decisions, had taught him that hesitation could be fatal. But it had never taught him how to recognize the difference between perception and reality. Elijah's dark eyes remained locked onto him, unwavering. The silence stretched. The bystanders watched, their tension building like a rising tide. Someone murmured, "He's not doing anything wrong." Another voice, shaky, nervous, whispered, "Is he gonna shoot?" Elijah's chest rose and fell steadily. He had been here before. Not exactly here, but close enough to recognize the pattern. An assumption, a gun, a command, and if he wasn't careful, an outcome he wasn't willing to let happen. His fingers twitched slightly. He had his military ID in his back pocket. He knew that if he moved too fast, it wouldn't matter what was in his hand. So, he did what he had done 1,000 times in combat. He controlled the situation. "Officer," he said again, his voice firm but slow. "I'm reaching into my pocket. I am not armed." Whitaker's jaw tightened. His grip on the gun stayed firm. Elijah moved with deliberate slowness, his fingers brushing against the edges of the worn plastic card that carried his name, his rank, his proof that he was not who Whitaker thought he was. And then in one controlled movement, he pulled it out, holding it up between two fingers. Whitaker's eyes darted to it, and then his breath caught. The name on the ID was not just a name, it was a rank, a title, a position that outranked him by more levels than he could count. Major Elijah Carter, United States Army, decorated, honored, a leader of men. And here he was, standing under the hot, brightened sun, held at gunpoint like a common criminal. The weight of what he had done, what he had almost done, crashed into Whitaker with brutal force. His grip on the gun loosened, his stomach twisted, the world around them held its breath. And Elijah Carter, still standing tall, still unwavering, waited to see what kind of man Officer Daniel Whitaker truly was. The silence was suffocating. The air in Brighton City felt heavier than it had just moments before, thick with a tension that wrapped around the street like an iron grip. The only thing louder than the distant hum of traffic was the unspoken question hanging in the air. What happens next? Officer Daniel Whitaker could feel his pulse hammering in his throat, his grip tightening and loosening around the handle of his Glock as his mind struggled to keep up with what was happening. Just seconds ago, everything had made sense. The dispatch report, the man in dark clothing, the reach into the pocket. It had all fit the kind of scenario that his training had drilled into him. The kind where a second of hesitation could mean the difference between going home at the end of his shift or bleeding out in the street. But now, he was staring at Major Elijah Carter's military ID, the words etched into the plastic cutting through him like a blade. United States Army. It wasn't just the rank that hit him, it was the realization of who he had nearly pulled the trigger on. Not a suspect, not a criminal, a soldier, a decorated officer, a man who had fought battles Whitaker couldn't even begin to comprehend. And yet, here they were. Elijah didn't move. His dark brown eyes remained locked onto Whitaker's, unwavering, unreadable, but charged with something that sent a ripple through the officer's gut. Disappointment. Frustration, familiarity, as if he had stood in this exact spot before, maybe more times than Whitaker could ever understand. The weight of his mistake pressed down on him like lead. His gun was still raised. People were still watching. Phones were still recording. Every choice he made from this moment forward was going to be permanent. A bead of sweat slipped down the side of Whitaker's face, but he didn't move to wipe it away. His hands felt suddenly foreign, like they belonged to someone else, someone reckless, someone dangerous. I was just responding to a report, he stammered, but the words felt weak, meaningless in the face of what had just transpired. Elijah didn't respond right away. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, his gaze dragging from the barrel of the gun to Whitaker's trembling fingers. His lips parted, and his voice, when it came, was calm, but there was something behind it. Something deep. "You still haven't lowered your weapon, officer." Whitaker flinched. He hadn't even realized. His training told him never to lower his gun until a situation was fully neutralized. But what the hell was the situation anymore? Was he de-escalating? Or was he still holding on, desperate to find some justification for what he had just done? The answer made his stomach twist. Slowly, like he was fighting against every rigid instinct screaming at him to stay in control, Whitaker lowered the gun, the weight of it suddenly unbearable in his hands. A collective breath rippled through the crowd. The tension shifted, but it didn't disappear. It clung to the air like smoke, thick and suffocating, because everyone knew what had almost happened. Elijah let out a breath through his nose, controlled, measured, then took a single step forward. Whitaker stiffened. Even with the gun no longer aimed, even with the realization of his mistake burning through his chest, he felt a flicker of something ugly rise inside him. Defensiveness, self-preservation, the human instinct to justify. But Elijah didn't attack, didn't yell, didn't demand anything. He simply asked, in a voice that was too damn steady for the situation, "What made you think I was the man you were looking for?" Whitaker's throat tightened. He didn't answer right away because he knew. He knew. The moment the call came in, the moment he saw Elijah, he had assumed. It wasn't conscious, it wasn't intentional, but it had happened. And now, standing in the middle of Jefferson Avenue, with dozens of people watching, recording, waiting, he had to face something he had never really had to before. Himself. His jaw clenched, the weight of his mistake crashing into him all over again. And then, from somewhere in the crowd, a voice, sharp, angry. "You were gonna shoot him." Whitaker's spine went rigid. His head snapped toward the sound, toward a woman standing just outside a cafe entrance, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Her expression was one of outrage, her eyes sharp with something accusatory. And that was all it took. The crowd, which had been holding itself in suspended breath, shifted. More voices joined in. "This happens all the time. If he wasn't in the military, would you have even thought twice? He didn't even do anything." The words cut deeper than they should have, because they weren't just about this moment. They weren't just about him. They were about all the other moments, just like this one. Moments where there hadn't been an ID to pull out. Moments where the outcome hadn't been a pause, but a trigger pulled. Whitaker felt his skin burn, not from the heat, but from the realization that this moment wasn't going to disappear. Not from the people watching. Not from the internet, where this video was almost certainly already being uploaded. Not from himself. His hands felt suddenly empty. But Elijah? Elijah still hadn't moved. He just stood there watching. Not with pity, not with hatred, but with something that made Whitaker feel even smaller. Expectation. Because Elijah knew this wasn't the end of it. The mistake had already been made. The only question left was, what would Whitaker do with it? The heat pressed down on Brighton City like an iron weight, but the air between Major Elijah Carter and Officer Daniel Whitaker was colder than steel. Whitaker's gun was no longer raised, but the damage had already been done. The street was alive with murmurs, the kind that twisted like whispers in a courtroom, growing louder, heavier, impossible to ignore. The people standing on the sidewalk, their phones still recording, had become witnesses. But not just to an incident, to a reality that played out far too often. And Elijah? He stood at the center of it all, his broad shoulders squared, his presence unshaken, but his fists clenched just enough to reveal the storm brewing beneath his composure. He was used to standing under pressure, used to being watched, scrutinized, tested, but that didn't mean he wasn't tired of it. He inhaled slowly, his chest rising with a quiet, controlled breath, then took a step closer. Not aggressive, not threatening, just deliberate. Whitaker's shoulders tensed, but he didn't move. He couldn't. His feet felt rooted to the pavement, held there by something stronger than fear, shame. A bead of sweat slid down the back of his neck. His heartbeat pounded in his ears as he became aware of every single eye on him. The woman by the cafe still had her arms crossed, her expression set in a grim line. The man recording from across the street hadn't lowered his phone. A group of teenagers whispered furiously to one another, shaking their heads, their expressions ranging from disbelief to something dangerously close to disgust. And then Elijah spoke. "Do you even see what you just did?" Whitaker's stomach twisted. He opened his mouth, but the words weren't there. Elijah didn't look away. His voice was calm, too calm. "You saw a black man and a report, and that was enough." A sharp exhale from someone in the crowd, a knowing murmur from another. Whitaker swallowed, his throat dry, his own breath suddenly feeling too loud. He wanted to explain, wanted to say it wasn't like that he wasn't like that he had just been responding to the call, that he was just doing his job, but the words tasted bitter before they even reached his tongue. Because deep down, beneath all the training, the reports, the instincts, he knew. He had never asked Elijah for his name, hadn't questioned his own assumption, hadn't considered the possibility that his own fear might have been built on something he didn't want to admit. And now, standing there, he was exposed, not just to the crowd, but to himself. The weight of that realization sat in his gut like a stone. Elijah shifted his stance just slightly, his ID still held between two fingers, the letters bold, unforgiving. "You pulled a gun on a superior officer," Elijah said, his voice as even as before, "and you didn't even know it." Whitaker blinked. The words sliced through whatever weak justifications he had tried to hold on to. It wasn't just any man he had threatened. It was someone who had served, who had protected, who had sacrificed for this country in ways Whitaker never had. And that was the moment it truly hit him. If Elijah hadn't been military, would he have survived this encounter? Whitaker's breath hitched, just for a second. And Elijah saw it. A small, almost imperceptible shift in his expression, like he was tired of seeing this realization come too late. But before Whitaker could respond, the voice of another officer cut through the tension like a blade. "What the hell is going on here?" The crowd parted slightly as Sergeant Mike Harris strode toward them. Late 40s, broad build, thinning hair, the kind of man who carried his years in his stiff posture and hardened expression. His gaze swept over the scene, his jaw tightening the moment he saw the gun still in Whitaker's hand. Whitaker felt the world tilt. His stomach twisted. He was still holding his weapon. His grip loosened immediately, and he holstered it, but the action felt too late. Sergeant Harris turned his attention to Elijah, his brows furrowing. His eyes flicked to the ID still held up, scanning the name, the rank, and then recognition. His lips parted slightly, but not in surprise, more like regret, more like he knew exactly what had just happened, and now he had to deal with it. "Major Carter," Harris said, his voice slower now, more careful. "Is everything all right?" The question hung in the air like an insult. Elijah's jaw flexed just slightly, his gaze steady. He took in every detail of Harris' expression, the forced politeness, the underlying discomfort, the weight of trying to smooth something over when everyone already knew what had happened. Elijah's response was measured. "No, Sergeant, everything is not all right." Another shift in the crowd, a ripple of murmured agreement, a quiet but unmistakable hum of accountability waiting to be answered. Harris exhaled, his fingers pinching the bridge of his nose for a split second before he turned to Whitaker. "You made a mistake." The words were sharp, but not nearly as sharp as they should have been, not nearly as cutting as what almost happened here. Whitaker clenched his jaw, his head dipping just slightly in acknowledgement, but he didn't say anything. Because there was nothing he could say that would make this moment disappear. Elijah studied him for a long beat. Then slowly he lowered his ID. The gesture felt bigger than it was, not forgiveness, not surrender, just an acknowledgement that what was done was done. And then finally he turned, away from Whitaker, away from the gun, away from the judgment. But not before meeting the eyes of every single person who had witnessed what happened. Because the moment wasn't just his. It belonged to every person who had ever stood where he stood. Every person who didn't have a military ID to protect them. And Whitaker? He just stood there, the world crashing down around him, knowing that this wasn't something he would walk away from unchanged. The world around them kept moving. Cars honked, sirens wailed in the distance, the city breathed as it always did. But for Officer Daniel Whitaker, time had splintered into a jagged, unrelenting moment he couldn't escape. The weight of his mistake was pressing down on him, sinking into his chest, making it hard to breathe. He had almost pulled the trigger. On the wrong man, on a hero. And now the silence between him and Major Elijah Carter was louder than anything else. Elijah had lowered his ID, but the tension between them hadn't dropped an inch. It sat thick in the air, palpable, like a storm that had only just begun to crack open the sky. The crowd hadn't moved either. People were still watching. Phones were still recording. Their expressions ranged from anger to exhaustion, like they'd seen this kind of scene play out too many times before. And then, cutting through the static of his thoughts, a new presence arrived. The kind of presence that demanded attention. The deep rumble of an engine, the sharp slam of a car door. Whitaker turned his head just in time to see a black SUV pulling up, its tinted windows reflecting the unforgiving glare of the sun. And stepping out of it was a man whose presence made the tension coil even tighter. General Robert McCall. Whitaker had never met him in person, but he didn't need an introduction to know who he was. The man carried authority like a second skin. Broad shoulders, crisp uniform, silver at his temples, and the kind of gaze that could strip a man down to the bone with a single look. And right now, that look was directed at Whitaker. His stomach plummeted. McCall's eyes flicked to Elijah for the briefest moment, and something passed between them. A kind of understanding, unspoken but solid, like they had been in enough battlefields, literal and otherwise, to know exactly what this moment meant. Then, the general's gaze snapped back to Whitaker. "You have any idea who you just pulled a gun on, officer?" Whitaker swallowed hard. His hands, now empty, felt like they weighed 1,000 pounds. His mouth opened, but no words came out. Because what could he say? That he had assumed? That he had let fear override reason? That in the space of seconds, he had nearly made a decision that could have destroyed a man's life, and his own? McCall didn't wait for an answer. He took a slow step forward, his boots solid against the pavement. The crowd, as vocal as they had been before, had fallen into a charged silence. "Major Carter," McCall addressed Elijah directly, his voice steady, but there was an edge to it, one that Whitaker recognized as anger. Not anger at Elijah, anger at him. Elijah's jaw was tight, but he gave a small nod, his voice, even when he finally spoke. "General," McCall exhaled through his nose, turning his attention back to Whitaker. "How long have you been on the force, officer?" Whitaker cleared his throat, barely recognizing his own voice when he answered. 8 years, sir." McCall's jaw tensed. 8 years. His voice was smooth, but there was something razor-sharp beneath it. 8 years, and you still don't know how to tell the difference between a suspect and a decorated officer of the United States Army? Whitaker felt the words like a punch to the gut. There was no justifying this. There was no explaining it away. He had pulled a gun on a man who had bled for this country, a man who had worn the uniform Whitaker claimed to respect. And that wasn't even the worst part. The worst part was the look on Elijah's face. Not rage, not hatred, just disappointment. Like he had seen this too many times before, like he had stopped expecting better. McCall took another step forward, lowering his voice just enough that it cut through the air with precision. "Let me explain something to you, Officer Whitaker." Whitaker braced himself. Major Carter didn't earn his rank sitting behind a desk. He's led men into combat. He's been deployed in places you wouldn't last a day in. And when he comes home to the country he serves, this is what he gets: a gun in his face from someone who should know better. Whitaker clenched his jaw, his shame so overwhelming it made him nauseous. McCall shook his head, eyes dark with something unreadable. "Tell me, officer, if that ID hadn't been in his pocket, how would this have ended?" Whitaker's breath hitched, his stomach twisted, because he knew. Everyone here knew. Elijah knew, McCall knew, the crowd knew. And the truth of it was like a bullet straight through his chest. He felt exposed in a way he never had before. Not because of the cameras, not because of the eyes burning into him from every direction, but because for the first time in his career, he was being forced to see himself. And he wasn't sure if he liked what he saw. McCall exhaled, looking down at the ground for a moment before straightening. Then he turned to Sergeant Harris, who had been watching the entire exchange in tense silence. "Take his badge for review," McCall said. "This is beyond unacceptable." Whitaker felt the words like a slap. Harris hesitated for only a second before stepping forward. Whitaker barely registered the weight of his own badge as it was unpinned from his chest. The moment felt surreal. 8 years on the force, and now in a matter of minutes, it had all come crashing down. McCall didn't say anything else. He didn't need to, because everything that needed to be said had already been spoken. And Whitaker? For the first time in his life, he had to listen. The world hadn't stopped moving, but for Officer Daniel Whitaker, it might as well have. His badge, his identity, his authority, his shield had just been unpinned from his chest. Sergeant Harris held it in his hand, the weight of it far heavier than the metal it was made of. The murmurs of the crowd had grown softer, but they were still there. A current of judgment, disbelief, and something even sharper, resentment. Because everyone watching knew exactly what this moment meant. They had seen it before. The only difference was that this time there had been a military ID to stop a bullet before it left the chamber. Whitaker didn't move. His hands hung limp at his sides, his fingers twitching with the phantom weight of his gun, the gun that had been in his grip just minutes ago, aimed at the wrong man. His mouth was dry. His pulse pounded against his skull, loud and unforgiving. He couldn't look at the crowd, couldn't look at the cameras, couldn't look at Elijah Carter, but he could feel him. Standing just a few feet away, his presence like a shadow stretching over the broken pieces of Whitaker's confidence. And then Elijah's voice cut through the noise. "Is that it?" It wasn't loud, it wasn't angry, but it might as well have been a hammer striking concrete. Whitaker's breath hitched. Elijah was staring at him now, and Whitaker could feel it, that quiet intensity that stripped away every defense, that every weak excuse forming in his mind. He forced himself to meet Elijah's gaze, and what he saw there made his stomach twist. It wasn't just disappointment, it was expectation. Like he was waiting, like this moment, this ugly, humiliating, defining moment, was a test. Whitaker licked his lips, his throat burning. He wanted to say something, anything. But what could he say? That he was sorry? That he hadn't meant to? That it had been a mistake? That he wasn't that kind of cop? None of it would mean a damn thing, because intentions didn't erase consequences. Elijah let out a slow breath, shaking his head just slightly. "This is what happens, isn't it?" His voice was level, but there was something sharp beneath it. A badge gets pulled, a review is promised, and then what? Whitaker's jaw clenched, because he knew what Elijah was really asking. What was going to happen after this? Would Whitaker learn from it, or would he let it become just another buried mistake? Would he tell himself that this was just one bad day, a fluke, something he could justify later? Or would he finally see what had been staring him in the face for years? The answer sat heavy in his gut, cold and unforgiving. McCall was watching too. The general had his arms crossed, his jaw tight, his presence still looming over the moment like a judge at a sentencing. And the worst part, he wasn't even angry anymore. No, McCall looked at Whitaker like he was already a footnote in the past. Like he had already been dismissed. Whitaker's fingers curled into fists. For years he had worn his badge like a guarantee, a sign that he was the good guy, that he was one of the ones who protected people. But today, he had been the reason a man had feared for his life. And that was something he couldn't outrun. Elijah exhaled, the sound slow, controlled, like he was forcing himself to stay measured. Then, finally, he turned. Not with victory, not with relief, just exhaustion. He started walking away, his boots hitting the pavement with deliberate steps. And just like that, the moment was over. For him, for everyone else, but not for Whitaker. Because as he stood there, badge gone, reputation shattered, truth finally exposed, he knew this moment would never leave him. The tension had settled over Jefferson Avenue like a heavy fog, thick and unrelenting. The murmurs of the crowd had dulled, but the weight of their stares remained, burning into Officer Daniel Whitaker as if they could brand him with his mistake. His badge was gone, his authority stripped away in seconds. But the shame, that clung to him like sweat in the sweltering Brighton city heat. He could still hear General Robert McCall's words echoing in his skull. 8 years on the force, and you still don't know the difference between a suspect and a decorated officer? Whitaker had wanted to defend himself, to say he had been following protocol, that it was all just a miscalculation, a misunderstanding. But there was no defense for what had happened, because no matter which way he tried to twist it in his mind, the truth refused to bend. He had seen a black man near a reported crime scene, and he had assumed that was it. That was all it took, and now, standing here, his career crumbling in real time, he realized just how close he had come to ruining another man's life. Or worse. The crowd hadn't fully dispersed, but the energy had shifted. There was no more shouting, no more immediate outrage, only judgment. Judgment that made Whitaker feel like a ghost of himself. He had been the one holding the gun. But in this moment, he had never felt smaller. Then, another sound. A deep, powerful honk cut through the stillness, the kind of sound that came from something big, something important. Whitaker turned his head just as another vehicle approached. A second black SUV, its tires rolling to a slow, controlled stop. And when the door opened, the situation shifted again. Because stepping out of that car was a man who made even General McCall straighten his shoulders. Brigadier General Thomas Grayson. A man who didn't just command respect, he demanded it. Tall, imposing, his uniform pressed to perfection, Grayson carried himself with the kind of authority that didn't require raised voices or unnecessary words. His very presence was the warning. His dark brown skin contrasted with the silver at his temples, his sharp, intelligent eyes scanning the scene with the kind of gaze that didn't miss a single detail. And right now, that gaze landed directly on Whitaker. The weight of it was suffocating. Whitaker had already felt small. Now he felt exposed. Grayson's expression was unreadable. His face was carved from stone, betraying nothing. No anger, no outrage, just a quiet, simmering intensity that felt more dangerous than anything else. He didn't speak immediately. Instead, he let the moment stretch, let the silence work for him. Then, his voice, measured, deep, the kind of voice that wasn't used to being questioned. "Tell me something, Officer Whitaker." Whitaker's breath stalled in his chest. "Did you think you were making the streets safer today?" The question was like a blade, cutting past whatever remaining justifications Whitaker had been clinging to. He forced himself to hold Grayson's gaze, but the shame was unbearable. He had spent 8 years believing in the righteousness of his badge, believing that he was one of the good ones. But today, that illusion had shattered, because good intentions didn't matter when the gun was already drawn. Whitaker's jaw clenched, but no words came out. Grayson didn't look surprised. He simply exhaled, his broad shoulders rising and falling in one slow movement before he turned to Elijah Carter. And everything changed. Because for the first time since this entire nightmare had begun, Elijah's posture softened. Not much, not fully, but just enough. Grayson was more than a commanding officer. He was a mentor, a man who had guided Elijah through some of the toughest years of his career. And seeing him here, not just as a superior, but as a man who understood what had happened today in a way no one else could, was something Elijah hadn't expected. Grayson looked him over, saw the tension in his stance, the exhaustion in his eyes, the weight of everything this moment had forced him to carry. And then in a voice only Elijah could hear, low, steady, knowing, he asked, "Are you all right, son?" Elijah didn't answer right away, because what did all right even mean? Did it mean being used to this? Did it mean carrying the quiet knowledge that it could have ended differently? Did it mean being relieved that this time it hadn't? Or did it mean accepting that this would happen again and again and again? So instead of lying, instead of pretending, Elijah simply said, "I'm tired, sir." Grayson nodded, his expression unreadable, but Elijah could see the truth in his eyes. He was tired too, and maybe that was the worst part. Because the weight of a gun pressed to your chest wasn't just about one man's mistake. It was about a system that had made it too easy for the mistake to happen in the first place. A system that, if they weren't careful, would let it happen again. Grayson turned back to Whitaker. The officer still hadn't moved, still hadn't spoken, still looked like a man who had been forced to confront something he had spent years avoiding. And Grayson, steady and controlled, gave him one last chance. "Tell me, officer," he said, voice razor sharp. "Now that you know who he is, does it change what you did?" Whitaker's stomach twisted, because he knew the answer, and he knew Grayson did too. The weight of Brigadier General Thomas Grayson's question hung in the air, suffocating. "Now that you know who he is, does it change what you did?" The words cut deep, exposing everything Officer Daniel Whitaker had been trying to ignore. He felt his throat tighten, his hands clammy at his sides, as every instinct inside him screamed for an answer, any answer, that would let him crawl out of this moment intact. But there was no right answer, because the truth was already there, bare and undeniable. If Elijah Carter had been just another civilian, another nameless black man walking down the street that day, would Whitaker have questioned himself at all? Would he have hesitated? Or would he have simply filed the incident away in his mind? Just another call, another routine response, another almost. The realization sat in his stomach like a stone, because he knew. And so did everyone else. The crowd was still watching, their silence more powerful than their earlier shouts. The weight of witnesses, of accountability, of something permanent pressed down on him like a crushing tide. He could still see the woman by the cafe, her arms folded tightly, her gaze sharp. The man with the phone, still recording, capturing not just his mistake, but his reckoning. And Elijah Carter? He was still standing there, still waiting, not for an apology, not for excuses, but for something real. Something that meant more than just empty words. Whitaker swallowed hard, his breath shaky. He could feel General McCall's eyes on him, Sergeant Harris's quiet disapproval, Grayson's unwavering stare, and all of them were waiting for the same thing, the truth, his truth. Whitaker forced himself to meet Grayson's gaze. He exhaled through his nose, his jaw tight, and then finally, he admitted it. No. The word felt foreign, raw, like he had never spoken it before. His voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. "No, sir, it doesn't change what I did." Something shifted in the air, a reaction, not relief, not vindication, but acknowledgement. Because the truth was ugly, but at least it was the truth. Grayson studied him for a moment longer, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, he nodded. Elijah, arms still crossed, tilted his head slightly, as if considering him for the first time. But it wasn't forgiveness, it wasn't acceptance, it was a moment, a crack in the wall, a chance to decide what came next. Whitaker let out a shaky breath. His body felt heavy, like he had just run a marathon but hadn't moved an inch. His past choices had brought him to this moment. His next choices would define what kind of man he really was. The street felt heavier now, like the air itself had turned into something dense, suffocating. Officer Daniel Whitaker could feel it pressing down on him, the weight of everything that had just happened settling into his bones like cold lead. He had spent years thinking he was one of the good ones, believing that wearing the badge made him different, that his intentions mattered more than his actions. But now that belief was shattered, crushed beneath the unflinching truth of his own mistakes. The moment was raw, unforgiving. He had stood there, gun drawn, judgment passed, decisions made without hesitation. He had been so sure, but he had been wrong, and there was no taking it back. Brigadier General Thomas Grayson hadn't moved, his presence still towering, still unyielding. His sharp, intelligent eyes remained fixed on Whitaker, waiting, not for more excuses, not for shallow apologies, but for something real. And beside him, Major Elijah Carter stood with his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. There was no rage in his face, no outward contempt. But there was something worse. There was expectation. Expectation that this wouldn't just be another moment that faded into the noise, another incident swept under the rug, another lesson Whitaker could walk away from unchanged. Whitaker swallowed hard, his mouth dry. His mind was racing, grasping for something, anything, to say. But what did you say to the man you almost killed by mistake? What did you say when you had already stripped him of his dignity before you even knew his name? The world around them kept moving, the city never stopping. And yet, this moment felt like it would never end. Then, from just a few feet away, Sergeant Mike Harris exhaled, breaking the silence. "Officer Whitaker." Whitaker turned his head, his heart lurching at the formality in Harris's voice. "You need to come with me." The words settled deep in his chest, heavy and final. The consequences had arrived. Whitaker felt the stares on his skin, burning. He could see some of the onlookers exchanging glances, whispers spreading through the air like wildfire. The crowd had come expecting an ending, and now they were getting one. His breath came uneven, his fingers twitching at his sides as he forced himself to step forward. Each step felt like a descent. Sergeant Harris didn't touch him, didn't grab his arm, didn't cuff him. But he didn't need to. The badge was already gone. The trust was already shattered. And whatever came next, whatever waited for him after this moment, was out of his hands. The city had not stopped moving, but for Major Elijah Carter, the moment lingered, stretching out like a shadow under the unforgiving brightened sun. The sirens had faded, the voices had dulled. The crowd had begun to thin, but the weight of what had just happened remained, pressing into the cracked pavement beneath his boots. Across the street, Officer Daniel Whitaker walked with Sergeant Mike Harris, his steps slow, almost reluctant. He wasn't in cuffs, but he didn't need to be. The badge that once sat over his chest, the shield that had protected him more than he ever realized, was gone. Stripped from him in front of everyone, he was facing consequences. But Elijah wasn't sure if they were enough. He stood still, watching, arms crossed, his breathing controlled, too controlled. Because inside, something burned. Not anger, not even relief. Something deeper, something colder. Exhaustion. This wasn't his first time standing in this position. It wasn't the first time he had felt the sharp edge of suspicion cut into his skin before his name had even been spoken. And the worst part, it wouldn't be the last. The thought made his jaw clench, made his fingers curl tighter against his arms. Then, from beside him, Brigadier General Thomas Grayson let out a breath. "You all right?" Elijah didn't answer right away. Because what did that even mean? What did all right look like in a moment like this? Did it mean accepting that he had just been seconds away from being another headline? Did it mean gratitude, that he had survived, that he had a name and a rank that had saved him before a trigger was pulled? Or did it mean knowing that next time, maybe that wouldn't be enough? He exhaled sharply through his nose, tilting his head just enough to glance at Grayson. "You ever get tired of this?" he asked, his voice even, but his eyes sharp. Grayson gave a humorless chuckle, shaking his head. "Every damn day." They stood in silence for a moment, both staring at the same street, the same cracked pavement, the same fading scene. Then Grayson spoke again. "I meant what I said back there, about how this doesn't just disappear." Elijah's jaw tightened, because he knew. He knew that before the day was over, the video would spread, that there would be arguments, debates, opinions from people who weren't even there. He knew that some would see the truth, that others would make excuses, that there would be people who still wouldn't believe it, even with their own eyes. And he knew that in the end, nothing would really change. Not yet, not today. Grayson sighed, rubbing a hand over his jaw. "You can't carry all of this on your back, Carter. You're not supposed to." Elijah scoffed, shaking his head. "Tell that to the ones who never got to walk away." Grayson didn't argue, because there was nothing to argue. The streetlights flickered on overhead, casting long shadows across the pavement, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Because in the quiet, they both knew the same truth. This fight wasn't over. The night had settled over Brighton City, but the weight of the day still clung to the air like humidity before a storm. The streets were quieter now. No more shouting, no more phones raised, no more sirens wailing. The echoes of what had happened still hung over Jefferson Avenue, invisible but undeniable. Major Elijah Carter sat in his car, parked just a few blocks away from the scene that had nearly rewritten his life. The streetlights flickered through the windshield, casting long shadows across the dashboard. His hands rested on the steering wheel, firm but unmoving. He hadn't turned on the engine yet. He wasn't sure why. Maybe because he needed a moment. A moment to sit in the silence and let it all settle. A moment to remind himself that he was still here. That his name, his uniform, his rank had saved him today. That it could have gone differently. That for so many others it had. His fingers tightened, his breath came slow, steady, controlled. Even now, after everything, there was no anger, no fury, just exhaustion. A kind that sat deep in the bones. A kind that couldn't be fixed with sleep. Because what had happened today? It wasn't new. It had never been new. It had only been his turn. He reached for his phone, swiping through notifications without really reading them. He already knew what they would say. The footage was already spreading. The headlines were already forming. The world was already watching. And tomorrow? Tomorrow, they would argue. They would dissect. They would choose sides. Some would say he had done everything right. Some would say Whitaker had done everything wrong. And some, the ones that exhausted him the most, would insist that nothing had really happened at all, that there had been no mistake, that a gun in his face had been reasonable, that he should be grateful he had walked away. His jaw clenched, and he set the phone down, exhaling through his nose. Grayson's words from earlier still echoed in his head. "You can't carry all of this on your back, Carter. You're not supposed to." But how could he not? He had spent years in war zones, navigating conflicts, leading missions, making impossible calls. But this fight was different, because in war at least he had known who the enemy was. Here, the enemy was something more dangerous. It wasn't just a person. It wasn't just Whitaker. It was something bigger. Something that couldn't be fought with weapons or tactics. Something that lived in the hesitation before a question was asked, in the assumption before a name was spoken. In the way that even now, after all his service, after all he had done for this country, he still had to prove he belonged in his own streets. A sharp knock on his window pulled him from his thoughts. He turned his head, spotting General McCall standing outside. His face was unreadable under the glow of the street lamp, but his presence was solid, like a man who had seen this moment play out before. Elijah rolled down the window. McCall studied him for a second before speaking. Headed home? Elijah hesitated, then nodded. Yeah. McCall exhaled, glancing down the street as if looking for something unseen, or maybe just thinking. Then his voice lowered. You know this isn't over, right? Elijah let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head. It never is. McCall sighed, nodding once. I wish that weren't true. Elijah didn't respond, because what was there to say? This was the world they lived in. The only difference was whether or not people were willing to see it. McCall tapped a hand against the roof of the car, then took a step back. Get some rest, Major. Elijah gave a small nod, turning the key in the ignition, the hum of the engine filling the quiet night. But as he pulled away from the curb, he knew the truth. There wouldn't be any rest. Not tonight. Not for a long time. Because what had happened today wasn't just his burden. It was a fight that had been passed down for generations, and it was far from over. And now I have to ask you, what would you have done in this situation? Would you have paused before acting? Would you have questioned your own biases? Or would you have made the same split-second mistake that almost cost a man his dignity, maybe even his life? This isn't just a story. This is a wake-up call. How many times have we judged someone before knowing their story? How often do we assume, react, and regret it later? And more importantly, how do we change? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I want to hear from you. Have you ever experienced or witnessed something like this? What do you think needs to change in our world today? If this video made you think, even for just a second, then make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss another powerful story like this one. Because conversations like these, they matter. And change starts with awareness. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.